Thank you for joining us today. My name is Heather, and I'm one of the assistant directors in the Office of Disability Resources at Appalachian State University. For reference, I go by she and her pronouns. Today, I'm wearing a white and blue dress. I'm in my mid-30s, and I have a brownish hair that could look red potentially on the screen. Because accessibility is always a collaborative effort, I'm pleased to be joined by Matt, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Matt Sotoff, and I'm the Accessible Technology Consultant at Appalachian State. And I am a white male in my 40s and have a beard that is dark and white, black and white, and thinning hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt today.
So we've been learning many great things today about digital accessibility. And so our session is going to focus specifically on making documents accessible. So when we design documents and structure them with accessibility in mind, it can allow for effective use by individuals with disabilities. There's a lot of different aspects to consider in document accessibility. Today, our focus is going to be just touching on the basics. We are going to talk about headings and styles. We also will discuss colors and contrasts, and also tips for images. You will learn that often the strategies we implement with documents, those strategies are similar to those that we would use in other platforms such as websites. We also, when we talk today, we're going to discuss a lot about, we use the word document. So I just want you to know, there's a lot of different platforms for what this can be focused on. So the focus of them will be documents in the digital world. But some of the strategies we talk about today could also be applied to printed materials, especially things like fonts and colors can be applied to both the digital and the printed world. One thing that we wanted to note is that depending on the platform that you're using and creating the documents in, there's probably going to be a lot of different ways to actually implement the specific accessibility features. So we're going to talk about the idea itself, but in where you're creating that material, it could be different on how you actually apply it. Unfortunately, there's no standard way of how we do all of the things we'll talk about today. But our hope is once you know the basic ideas and fundamentals that you can apply them to what specific platform you're using to create those materials. And you can skip ahead. Yeah, thank you. So applicable federal mandates. So we've all mentioned today that we're guided in this work to make materials accessible by federal mandates. So I'm just going to briefly review that. Overall, there are many federal laws which address the rights of individuals with disabilities, inclusion and accessibility. And so these laws require equal access and opportunity for participation, full and equal enjoyment, and effective communication. So when the ADA was created, the web was basically in its infancy. And so when we discussed at the time places of public accommodation and program services and activities, it wasn't totally focused on the web at the time. So we have now interpreted those terms to include digital aspects and virtual places, such as digital services and online content. And there have been established guidance and standards for electronic and information technology compliance since then. Additionally, Section 508 establishes requirements for federal agencies regarding this digital accessibility. So I'll let Matt talk.
So the accessibility of different materials can affect a range of disability categories. Most often, the impact is for those with visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive or sensory impacts. And when I mention digital accessibility, I'm talking about anything from websites to newsletters to email to a course document. But as we mentioned, today we'll focus on the accessibility skills that benefit many people, but will most often benefit those with visual, motor, and cognitive impacts. And often when we talk about disability, and the ADA, we're talking about permanent disabilities. But disabilities are a form of impairments, and impairments can be temporary, such as having an arm injury and being unable to use a mouse. Or it can be situational, like being unable to see clearly because you've had your eyes dilated at the optometrist. I point this out because when we address accessibility for those who are permanently disabled, it also benefits those with temporary or situational impairments. Just like reading the closed captions when you're in a loud room, trying to understand what they're saying on TV. I know I do that when, especially if it's a British show, sometimes I turn those on and they benefit me. Or if I have my hands full of groceries, I might use the ramp instead of steps, for example.
So what does accessibility really mean? Accessibility means that an individual with a disability can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time and effort as someone that doesn't have a disability. It allows individuals with a disability to have independence to engage in the same interactions, acquire the same information, and enjoy the same services. Judith touched on this morning. If she wanted to stay up at 2 a.m. reading materials online, then anyone, regardless of a disability, should have that same access and the ability to read those materials online at 2 a.m. if they chose to. So as we talk today and provide some tips on document accessibility, we just want you to keep that in mind, that many of the strategies you use to create or remediate your documents really do have a major impact on helping users have an equitable experience. And like Matt said, creating documents in an accessible way can benefit all users. We did touch on the laws before, so there is that idea that compliance is necessary. But when we focus on accessibility, that means that more users can utilize your materials. Everybody can navigate better, and it advocates for more inclusivity. I think that when we see these practices put into action, even when it's not a direct need for the user, it creates that idea that, hey, I'm welcome here. And if we create documents to be accessible from the beginning, it reduces costs and saves time and effort in the future if we don't have to remediate those documents.
So we have a student at App State whose disability impacts vision, who uses screen reading technology. And she said this about accessibility. Accessibility changes my experience by not only allowing me to further my education, but makes me feel equal to my sighted peers. Every person, no matter race, sexual orientation, or disability, should have an equal and fair chance to achieve whatever goals they may have in life. I bring this up to help us regain focus on the impact of working toward accessibility. It isn't about trying to give someone more work to do as a content creator or trying to remediate a document, but it's about giving equal access to all. All right, so we're going to get into some accessibility basics. These basics are principles that apply across digital mediums. So a lot of these can apply to social media, websites, but also, as Heather mentioned, across different document types, from emails to newsletters, course material, office documents, things like that. So let's begin by looking at these two pictures on the screen. The picture on the left is a 2-story wood, and I assume plaster building that looks quite old, whose sidewalls are touching the buildings next to it. The second picture is of workmen using tools to smooth out concrete for what I assume is the foundation of a building in what appears to be a neighborhood based on a wooden fence and other homes in the background. So if our goal is to improve access to both of these buildings, and someone says you need to add an elevator to each of these, which one do you want to add it to? Can you add an elevator to each of these buildings? Yes. Which building would be easier to make accessible at this point? Well, although you may be able to add an elevator to each building, the older one with the walls touching, as well as the new construction, it would be easier and likely quicker and cheaper to add elevator to the new construction. It's the exact same when we're talking about document accessibility. If you think about the first image of an old building as a previously made document, it's possible to make it accessible but not as easy as making the building accessible from the beginning, like the new construction. Similar to this morning during the keynote where Judith mentioned the scans of documents. What we do with a scan of a document, if it comes out as an image, then we put it through optical character recognition and we'll add another layer on top to make it more accessible. But those programs are interpreting what's there. And so your end document will only be as good as your beginning document. So it's actually easier, quicker, cheaper probably as well, to make these accessible from the beginning. So remember, all these basics you can apply when creating the document. And the more you do that, the better your end result will be. So document accessibility has a bunch of benefits. It makes a document more readable, makes it easier to navigate. It increases usability by all, including those with assistive technologies. But as we mentioned, the most important to me is it gives equal access to the content, regardless of format. Today's presentation is just an introduction to these basics. So we won't get into the how-to for all of these, because that can differ based on if you're on a Mac or a PC or Microsoft Word or Google Docs. And so really we're covering the zoomed out, if you think of Google Earth, the high level view of document accessibility. But if you're interested and want to know more of the how-to, the nitty-gritty, I encourage you to choose these links at the bottom of these slides, and they will take you to additional information. You will notice, however, that these are the most common formats we use for creating documents. But as we go through these different accessibility basics, you'll notice there may not be a link for, say, PowerPoint when we're talking about headings. And that's because there's not a way to do that in PowerPoint. So if something's not there, it's worth looking into. I mean, technology changes all the time. But in general, these will give you additional information that you can really dive into.
So one area that you can focus on with accessibility in documents is color and contrast. Color and contrast have a big impact on how users interpret and interact with information. Color generally should not be used as the only visual means of conveying info, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. So basically what this means is that you don't want to use color to represent important information. An example of this is if you colored something in the document green, meaning that you thought that meant good information, versus red, meaning bad information. On the other hand, contrast refers to basically a ratio of light between foreground and background. And it's the ability for someone to see colored text sharply against a background. Contrast usually has a numerical value assigned for that ratio. And there are some free color contrast tools available that you can Google and find online and play around with, just so you have an idea of what appropriate color contrasts are. People with low contrast sensitivity, which is usually impacts many as you age, or users with color blindness are going to really greatly benefit from using correct color contrast. Another idea for contrast is complementary colors. So colors across from each other on a color wheel. That helps for use of maximum readability. If you're thinking about logos, often businesses are really focused on that color contrast idea. So if you think about an IKEA logo where you have blue and yellow sharply against each other, FedEx is another good example of a logo that uses color in the correct way. So this slide that we have here is an example of how contrast is necessary. It may be difficult for some of you to see yellow on the screen because there are links that are in yellow that are against a white background. And so yellow and white are not contrasting colors, and therefore it makes the text very unreadable. Corrected contrast would allow those colors and text to be distinguishable. So this is an example of one that you don't want to use. This example is an example of a colored chart. There's a chart with rainbow colors on it, and it's designating specific internet browsers that a user could use. Now, this is also an example of how color is being used to convey meaning. And so if you're unable to see the colors on this color chart, you wouldn't be able to interpret that data to know which color is in relation to which specific web browser. So this is another example that needs attention and needs to be adjusted. And our third example is using a color chart with patterns. So you can use color, we just need to make sure that you use it in a way where you can also interpret the data without just that use of color. And so there are patterns assigned to each color here on this color chart. So each color has a pattern assigned to it to help the user also designate that data better. So this is a better way to use color. And fonts. So choosing fonts is also an important aspect to consider when focused on document accessibility. Most documents are text heavy, so readability of text is vital. When choosing a font, it's best to use ones that are sans serif. Sans is the French word for without. So there are fonts that are simpler and they do not have extended lines or features on them. So a good way to remember that is feet or without feet. So if you're looking at a font and it has curling or cues on the ends, those are considered the feet. And so we want to use fonts that don't have that. Spacing and thickness is also important. So inaccessible fonts are ones that we want to avoid, and those are ones that make the text harder to read, make it very difficult to distinguish between the shapes of different letters and characters, and then slow down that reading speed of the user. They also might have overlapping letters or characters, which would make it really difficult for someone to distinguish one letter from another. And so our next slide gives some examples of fonts that are decorative. So on the left, there is a sentence that says, "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog." That font is in a curly cursive font. And it can be challenging to distinguish between the letters. They're very close together. They're just not very distinguishable. And this, you can see from this example that spacing is very significant. The one on the right is the exact same sentence. "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog." And it is in a font that we have recommended. And it is spaced out well. There aren't any curves. Each letter is distinguishable, which also makes each word distinguishable. One thing that we do want to mention is that there are some preferences depending on disability when it comes to font. So while we're recommending those sans serif fonts, Arial, things like that, we found that some users do have a different preference. So users with dyslexia often have a preference versus others. And so that's just something to consider. There's also been discussions over printed material versus online material in terms of font selection and whether you should use sans serif or serif fonts. So since many of the materials you're working on, you would create, your documents are likely to be in a digital format. That's probably where you want to focus. But something to consider when creating that is the ability for the user to manipulate and change text to their preference if they could. So if you are creating something, could they have access to a Word document where they actually could change the text font, change the text colors, change the text sizing, so that depending on preferences, that could be usable, better used for them.
So we had a question about line graphs that use color to distinguish different variables, and how can you make that accessible? And I think for that, anytime you have a graph, if you can include the data, that's helpful. So that's a place to start. If it is a line graph, I mean, you might want to look and see if there is a different way to a different graph format that can convey the same material. In addition, graphs are getting better. In Word, for example, I think it's Word or might be Google Docs. I go often back and forth through them, but one of them, the pie chart that we showed, that has the different, it has the key next to it with the colors, but it's separate kind of from the graph itself. It might be, I think it's in Google Docs. Those graphs, they actually have a line that connects from the key to the graph area. So it might just be checking what different formats are available. But I think you're right, just relying on that color is not the way to go. All right, so next we're going to talk about headings. Headings describe the content that follows. It's kind of like a news article. It has the headline that tells you what the rest of the article is about. So sighted readers, we look at headings quickly to navigate to the part that we want to on the page. If it's a student that wants to know about the attendance policy, they can quickly scan if there are headings included and know where to go. It's the same for someone that is using a screen reader, that they would, if those headings are used appropriately, then they can navigate to the part of the page that they want to before reading that text that's under it. So we want to use the built-in heading styles. And what it means by that is if you're in a Word document, up at the top in that ribbon across, it'll say title, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and so on. And that's a good place to where you can choose your font, your heading. In Google Docs, this is right next to the font type. So if it says Arial or something, right next to that is where you choose those heading styles. It's important, just so you know, you should have a heading 1, which is your document title or the main heading. Generally, there's only one though for your document. Then heading 2 is a major section that's under that. And then heading 3 is under that, and so on and so on. So it goes down and down. What's important is that you don't skip levels. So on the website, I've worked with some of our folks here that some people use settings just because they like the style of it. And what I mean by that is they like how it looks. So they might choose heading 4, even though that's not where it actually should fit in the document hierarchy. It should be a higher up heading, but they just like how it looks. So I want you to remember, like, you can change how those look. You can change it to what you want it to be, and then you can update. So all of your headings have the look that you want. You don't have to use those built-in colors or sizes or fonts even. You can change it, but just by using those buttons to choose the heading style, you are adding some structure kind of behind the scenes that you can't necessarily see when you first glance at a document. And it's important not to skip those headings, again, because screen reader users may think they've missed something. If you skip from 2 to 4, they might go, well, was there a level 3? What did I miss? So that's why that's important. When you're in Google Docs, this is just an example, but it's a way to see what's kind of going on behind the scenes. So this image on the right is just where you're entering your document. But then on the left, it shows the breakdown of those different headings. And so again, it just makes it easier to navigate for sighted or unsighted users.
Matt, we actually have a related question for headings. Scott asks, what about when the tool has a title style in addition to H1, like in Word or Google Docs? Are multiple H1 accessible or acceptable in that circumstance?
I would say it's probably accessible, but it's better practice just to do the heading one and to do it that way, because it depends on the technology, the assistive technology, and how it reads it and how you output and all kinds of technical things. So if possible, I would just make it heading one and then go from there. That helps build that style in the correct way.
And he says, thanks. There is another question about color, if y'all want to take that now, or we can keep moving and come back. Okay, go ahead and take it. Someone is, oh, cool. Someone similarly curious about if there is a recommended color scheme other than black and white.
So black and white is considered the maximum contrast. So other ones that are similar to black and white would be like navy and white, cream and like a dark brown, yellow and black. So those are typically the best color schemes to use. And they're also really accessible in the way that some readers will use kind of grayscale or black and white mode, and all of those usually can still be seen in those modes. Ones to avoid would be like orange. The way that orange is portrayed as a color, it's really difficult to contrast that with other colors. And then, like I mentioned, like red and green are not distinguishable between each other.
All right, lists are another feature that give a document structure. It's important for screen readers that you use the built-in list type button for bullets or numbers. Don't use self-made bullets. And the lists using those buttons is helpful because it provides greater visual clarity. We talked about readability earlier. If you have a whole wall of text or just a bulleted list, it's a lot easier to scan through that bulleted list than the wall of text for the relevant information. Again, these are the buttons that are usually in that toolbar, whether you're in most any of the programs we've talked about. And when I talk about self-made bullets, what I mean are things like this. So on the left-hand side, the ones that need attention, I made a list of some of the topics that we've covered, color and contrast, font, headings list. But I use different characters to be those bullets. If you're using a screen reader, it's going to say dash, color and contrast plus font. And it's going to be very confusing. It's not going to convey that information correctly. A better example is on the right, and it uses that bullet button for the list.
The next area we want to address is tables and using tables in your documents. So tables are probably one of the trickiest aspects when it comes to document accessibility. I've been in this field in higher education for 15 years now. And so I've seen lots and lots of syllabi, which is probably the most common document that everyone in higher education is creating if they're a faculty member. And for some reason, faculty over the years have liked to use tables because it's easy to organize information. So that's often been a common aspect on a syllabus. But when you use a table, it really should only be used when the actual information in the table is necessary to be provided in a table format. Oftentimes in the syllabus, it's used for formatting purposes because it's just easier to kind of organize the info. And so like Matt mentioned with headings earlier, the way that a sighted individual views a table or something with headings is that similar idea. A sighted individual can make sense of the information in that table by visually scanning. But a screen reader has a very, very hard time portraying information correctly to a user unless it's coded properly. So when it comes to wanting to insert a table into your documents, just ask yourself this question: does this information have meaning that is independent of it being in columns and rows on a grid? So if it's yes, then don't put it in a table. If it's no, then there's specific steps that you can do to make sure your data is succinct and coded properly. So remember that screen readers read in a linear way. So it does not have the ability to scan the information the same way a sighted user would by interpreting the column and row at the same time. So it would really just read the data going from one cell to another across, which can be pretty confusing. However, if you use headers in your table and designators within those cells, then a screen reader can more easily navigate amongst those cells. And like Matt said earlier, we do have links at the bottom of this slide that give you specific information on how to create tables within different formats. So we have Word, PowerPoint, and PDF, since it is slightly different depending on those formats.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about links. Imagine going on an elevator, pressing a button and not being sure where the elevator would stop and you had to get off. It's a similar experience for someone using a screen reader if a link says click here. They have no idea if that link will take them to relevant information, download a document, open YouTube video of cats. Instead, it's better to use a descriptive link name instead of http://www or click here. It's better, like we did at the bottom of these, links or accessible documents presentation, and link that entire those words to the appropriate reference. Avoid very long links, and you can use link shorteners. It just helps everybody. This applies to the web, but on this page we have an image of when I am a Mac user, when I am using my screen reader software, there's a way that I can visually show the links that are on a page. So it makes it easy to navigate to those. Like you can see there's some that say view text only version, skip to main content, skip to main navigation. Those are descriptive. Those I know exactly what's going to happen when I click on them. The ones that say here or suspicious, we don't know what's going to happen with those. Those aren't clear what those pages are taking. So we can change that. This is one of those very low level accessibility things that we can all work on, whether it's in emails or documents or websites, that makes a difference and is good practice. It's good to learn.
So one last thing that we want to touch on is images and inserting images into your documents. So there's two aspects to images that we'll discuss. One are actual visual images, so like a picture of a bunny, and the other are images that could contain words or important information like signage. So both would need to have alternative text added to them so that the information can be read or conveyed to screen reader users. So we have a couple of examples for you. And our first example is going to be an image about bunnies. So on the screen, we have an example image. And if I didn't share any information about it, if you were able to see this image, then you would not know what it is. So this is just an example of some bunnies on a field. And so I can see that as it is two bunnies on green grass. There's a gray bunny on the left and there's a white bunny on the right. But I am sighted and can see that. So if you are an individual that needs to use a screen reader, that information isn't anywhere unless we put alt text behind that image so that a screen reader could read and have that information conveyed. So depending on your program, there's probably different ways to add that alt text. And so generally there's a way to add that information in, and it would just be textual information that you would type in to describe that image. There's also often two different kind of levels of descriptive. So depending on that image, you might add more information if you feel like there's more that needs to be conveyed beyond that image. For this one, if the document has really nothing to do with bunnies and you're just trying to say there's two bunnies, it could just say there's two bunnies. But let's say that you wanted the user to be able to know the colors of the bunnies and what they're doing, then you could add those descriptors in there as well. Another example of images that are going to need alternative text would be images that convey textual information. So there is an image on the screen that is of a mountain background, and the information, there's information textually that's overlaid. So it says Transfer Overlook, preparing for the transfer experience, Saturday, March 20th, 2021, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. It's offered by Appalachian State University from Online and Transfer Services. That all is important information to know. So if someone was needing to come to a transfer session and needed to know what time and date it was, the screen reader wouldn't know that information. It probably would just pop up and say image, unless we put information behind that, so that a screen reader could read that textual information. Alternatively, we can put that information below the image, so that the screen reader could then read that information and know and be able to access that information. So our next slide is an identical picture to the one I just described, but below the image is that important textual information. Saturday, March 20th, 2021, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., offered by Online and Transfer Services. So the screen reader would be able to read.
We have a few questions that I'm gonna go over real quick. How much detail should you go into with alt text? I think it depends on the picture, it depends on your audience, it depends on the purpose behind the document. So I know that's not a very good answer, but it's kind of an art form, and can't say that I'm an expert in it by any means. But I would encourage you, if you are interested, click those links at the bottom to find out more information about that. And then I had a question about link shorteners having security issues. I have not heard of that, but that does not mean it's not true. You can look into that. I mean, I don't think a link shortener is necessary by any means. So don't make that a make or break issue. Next, when trying to eliminate the use of click here, we sometimes get pushback from colleagues who claim our older audience doesn't recognize a register button in an email and say the email needs to include click here to register. Have you heard of that? I have not heard of that. It makes sense. So I think, again, if you're not just having the click here, but you're adding that descriptor, that's okay. And that's helpful. You also do want to make sure your buttons are labeled correctly. So again, that's where some of these are just guidelines that may have different nuances based on the audience that you're speaking to, or have the document for, or based on sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, the job that you're in. So if you're a science teacher, you may have different needs in the alternate text than somebody that works in news or is getting a digital newsletter out. All right, we have some more pictures of images, but we're gonna finish up first, and then we can get back to those with our extra time. This was mentioned earlier. Some programs have built-in accessibility checkers that will help you identify these areas that we've discussed. From Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel, the checker is under the Review tab. Adobe Acrobat has a Make Accessible wizard under the Tools and Action Wizard menu. Google products don't have an auto checker. There is a paid add-on called Grackle that you can do. I haven't used it too much, so I can't speak about it, but I know it is there, and I know NC State uses it as well. So I've heard good things, but I don't have a lot, so I can't speak from that experience level. But these are great places to start when reviewing your document, and it does go over headings, alternate text. It might encourage you with contrast and color. So a lot of things that we discussed will be covered in those accessibility checkers. There are various document formats we've talked about: PDF, Word, Google Docs. Sometimes it's hard to know what format is best based on the situation with which it'll be used. The North Carolina Higher Education Digital Accessibility Collaborative developed a draft decision tree with questions and considerations to help you So if you follow the link on this page, it's open for anybody to use. We just ask that if you refer to it, that you give the attribute to us. So it'll help you know the most appropriate format based on what you're looking to do. I know we've covered a lot of basics today. It can be very overwhelming if you think of, oh my gosh, I have to do all these things for every document. But I want you to remember, you don't have to do all of these at once to implement. For example, our office began using headings in all of our Google Docs and all of our internal office things. And now it's second nature. We just know to do it. And we're building in other areas of accessibility as we go. Same thing, you don't have to do it in every realm of your life necessarily, but start with, if you're an instructor, start with your syllabus. That is an amazing place to start. So with that, we're going to go to some questions.
And I'm happy to read those for you all, if that helps. Cool. So we have a question from Jason. He says, say a page is a grid of image results where each image has an associated text below the image. Both image and text are links to the same resource. Should we hide the link on one of them for screen readers? Or can you suggest another way or any other remediations to avoid duplicate links?
That's a toughie. I've seen that before. And I don't have a great answer for you. I'm sorry. But other people have answered amazing questions in the chat. And so if anybody has ideas, that would be super helpful and something that I can learn as well. So sorry about that.
Great. And next question from Darren. Is it useful to include information in an alt tag which would only be meaningful to sighted users? To use your example, if someone has been blind their entire life and doesn't know what gray and white are, is there any point in describing the bunnies as such?
That's a good question. I think that it depends on what you're trying to portray in the image. But we do also have blind individuals who may not have been blind their whole life that do have concepts of color, or if they have been blind, have concepts of a color in a different way. So they know color in certain aspects, they may just not know the color like we know the color. So I still think it's beneficial to include that information.
Awesome. And one more question. I think this goes back or may relate to the earlier link shortener question. Someone asks, what about QR codes?
I'm not sure what that question is referring to. Maybe does it need alternate text? I'm guessing. But I have not encountered that, so I'm not sure how to answer that question. Can whoever asks that add a little bit more information? That would be helpful.
This is Brad from UNC Chapel Hill. I'd also like to maybe chime in on that. That is really an advanced technique of making your QR codes accessible. A lot of times you'll see QR codes in a physical world where you can scan with your phone. But if you do use a QR code, there are a few resources on the internet to teach you how to code your QR code. It's a hard thing to think about, but how to code the actual HTML. So actually you use ARIA to do so, to be able to make it so it is accessible. But using best practices that you use with alt text, like making a caption below, is also something that people do, because a QR code essentially most of the time takes you to a web link. There's nothing wrong with putting that web link below, even though it's not best practice to not, to use a hyperlink in order to indicate that. Here in this case, if it's a printed document, then that'll be fine, because someone could actually read that out, which they couldn't see if it was printed out a hyperlink before. Does that sort of answer that? Make more sense? I'll put a link into the chat for that more advanced coding for QR codes.